Hey, what's up, guys? This is Outside the Octagon with our very first podcast episode. And today, this is the first episode of our series. We're going to be uploading every week or every 2 weeks. And we're just going to be talking about the UFC events inside and, as you can tell, outside the Octagon. So, Banner, we can start with you.
All right. So, just like you said, you kind of summarized it all. We're probably going to try to do this every 2 weeks with the UFC schedule and like the pay-per-views and everything. So, we'll probably talk about whenever we come back, we'll talk about the card that just happened and then some future news. So, I guess we'll just start off now. We'll talk about UFC 286 to start off. So in the main event of 286, we saw Leon Edwards and Kamaru Usman fight for their third time for the title. And obviously, Leon Edwards came out successful in this and he won the rivalry. So there's been a lot of talk about this recently, just because the aspect of who's next for a title shot. And we'll just get this out of the way. Dana White says that Colby Covington is next for the title shot. He said this after 286 in the post press conference, and he said this last night as of our recording after the Sandhagen um, fight card. And he said that like nothing has changed within that week, and he thinks Covington should get the title shot, and he will. So, what do you think about this? Do you think Covington deserves the title shot?
Yeah, I mean, as much as people hate Colby Covington, I think he 100% deserves it. A lot of people recently, there's been a lot of disputes from like a lot of weight classes, like middleweight, welterweight, and with this weight class where Covington deserves it because people argue on one side that they should only go by the rankings, and he's the number one ranked fighter below the champion. So, of that basis, he deserves the fight. And then other people argue it only should be off merit and who you fight against. But Leon Edwards, he didn't have the best resume when he got to fight Usman for the belt. He fought a washed Nate Diaz. He got clipped, and he could have definitely lost that fight, although he should have won, and he did win. But I think Covington deserves it. People don't like him for his character and the way he acts, but in my opinion, he did lose to Usman. Not like he performed worse than Edwards did, but still not terrible performances. And let him get the shot. If he doesn't deserve it, then Edwards will prove that he didn't deserve it.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of in a weird scenario right now because, I mean, even if you had him fight Usman again, like I don't think that would happen, but I still think Usman is a better contender than Covington. But like, obviously, you're not going to have that fight for a fourth time again. But I mean, Covington hasn't fought in a year at this point, and he's just been sitting out. I know Dana White said that he's been sitting out with an injury from when he got jumped, which I don't know I mean, I don't know how I feel about that, having to sit out for a year after that. But I mean, there's a lot of people in the mix. So obviously, if you look at the rankings, we have Bilal Muhammad, who a lot of people are um, vying for right now. They think that he deserves a title shot. And Gilbert Burns up there too. Um, even Cosma at this point. Like there's a lot of guys in the top five who deserve a title shot. And I think I wouldn't be upset with the idea of Covington getting a title shot if it wasn't like if Dana White didn't come out and basically say, yeah, he's getting the title shot 100%. Because before this, if we're looking ahead, like the next main event, like pay-per-view card that we have is Gilbert Burns against Jorge Masvidal. And basically by saying Covington getting the title shot, that kind of makes that fight useless because there's no point in that fight at this point. Because before that, you could say that maybe this would be a number one contender fight. But now with Covington getting the title shot, it kind of just makes that useless. But also, I mean, I want to ask you, besides Covington, like let's say if he loses this fight, who would you have next against Edwards, assuming that with it being March now, if he fights in June or July, that he'll end up fighting at the end of the year. Who would you say should be the next contender after that?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of guys that could come down to. And the first thing I did want to butt in and say is that is DC said it against the John Jones in their two fights where if you lose twice to someone, it's really not really a rivalry anymore. You got to get over that. And whether like same with John Jones or DC, where he won 2 fights, maybe illegitimately. He tested positive for various different things on both fights. So even if people are saying Edwards, he cheated, he didn't deserve it, it was a fluke, like John Jones still won both fights, and so did Edwards. So at the end of the day, you got to win the fights. But that being said, yeah, definitely can't be Usman anymore. I think, yeah, outside of Covington, if we're talking, I think Gilbert Burns impresses me a lot. Kimiev, Bilal Muhammad has good fights, but Sean Brady was his last fight, who was a really hyped up prospect, undefeated when they fought, I believe. And he did win, but he almost lost. And I'm gonna be honest, Muhammad does not impress me at all. I'd have Rakhmonov, Burns, or Kimiev all higher, but I say it is tough. I say give it. Obviously, you just say outside Covington, but probably Kazmat Kimiev is my next up, and then Burns right below them.
So, speaking of this, Dana White said that he's trying to get a fight around the summertime between Rakhmonov and Muhammad. So, considering this, I would say that that's probably the number one contender fight. Especially if you have those two fighting. Like, I don't really care that much about if Jorge wins against Gilbert Burns. I don't really want to see him get a title shot at this point. I mean, it would be good with a storyline if Covington ends up beating Usman, or not Usman, Edwards, and then we have that. But if Covington loses to Edwards, I don't really want to see an Edwards Jorge Masvidal fight at this point. I'd rather give it to the younger guys because there's so many guys in this division too that deserve a title shot that haven't got one yet. And even like the same path that we saw with Leon Edwards, where he had to take all these fights building up to it. And now it just seems like we're kind of giving out title shots to the guys who are going to get the biggest pay-per-view draw. Like obviously Colby Covington deserves it. He's a top 5 guy, but you also have to think if he wasn't like the presence that he is, would he really get the title shot this easily?
Yeah, I mean, welterweight's one of the deepest weight classes right now. It's super interesting, and I mean, Covington, in my opinion, he's fought all the Usman fights. Even though he lost them, it kind of proves that he's up there for a reason. And Masvidal, I'm not a fan of either. I think he's lost some bad fights. He doesn't impress me at all. I think I think the fight with Burns is going to be very interesting because I think looking ahead to it, I think that's an easy win for Burns. But obviously, UFC, anything can happen. So yeah, I honestly I would not want to see Masvidal fight for the belt ever again unless he has some crazy run. But I think it's really going to come down to the three of Rakhmonov, Burns, and Kimiev because Kazma has looked incredible in all of his fights and his against guys like Holland, like young guys, he's dismantled them and out wrestled them in literally minutes at the start of the fight. So he's looked impressive, but I say you let Colby go for the belt, and then let's say after that, even if Colby does get the belt, or let's say if he loses, Edward keeps it. I still don't think you could give it to Masvidal. I think he'd have to fight an additional fight to prove he's actually back up to a challenger status for the belt.
Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely one of the deepest weight classes, if not the deepest right now. And I think the only way that I would want to see Jorge fight for the title is obviously if he wins his next fight. And then if Covington wins the title, I'd like to see that fight. But if Covington doesn't win the title, which if he fights Edwards at this point, I'm not really sure if he does. I think it'll be a close fight, but I don't know if he wins that fight. But if he does, I'd like to see that match and we can see Mr. America versus Street Judas again. So moving on, in the co-main event of 286, we saw Justin Gaethje fighting Rafael Fiziev, and this was, I mean, I'll speak for myself first. I think this was a better fight than I was expecting, and I know we talked about it too. And Dana White ended up giving this fight of the night pretty easily. I mean, that was a really good fight to start off. So from this, I want to ask you, since Gaethje won this fight, he's kind of in this spot of limbo in the lightweight division with Islam being the champion. And then Oliveira is going to end up fighting for kind of that number one contender spot coming up soon. And so where do you see Justin Gaethje? Because Dustin Poirier is above him right now. And he's at 3, but it doesn't seem like he's going to get a title shot, even though he just won. He keeps fighting guys under him. Where do you see Justin Gaethje going from here?
Yeah, I mean the UFC is in a great spot where there's not really guys that are absolutely dominating the weight classes. The belts are moving between guys so often now, and like I just said, welterweight's the most deep weight class, but lightweight's also super impressive, and it is really tough. Gatesy, I think, in my opinion, you should reward his fight behavior, the way he fights, and that was a crazy impressive fight. A lot of guys would not take the damage he does and not even bleed or look like he just fought. Where Fiziev was completely, his face was absolutely destroyed that fight. Blood was flying everywhere. So, yeah, I'd have Poirier above him, and Charles. Obviously, he wants that belt back from Islam Makhachev, but I think you need to keep rewarding fighters like that, even if he loses close fights or he loses fights like his fight with Khabib. I think you have to reward fighters that will get you the excitement, because at the end of the day, it is entertainment. They want to make their money, they want their pay-per-views and their sales. So I think you give him the biggest fights you can, even guys, if it has to be Poirier or I think he has a fast track to the belt solely off the way he fights, because even if he loses these really competitive fights, the way he fights and the way he recovers, he almost never takes much damage. He has, in my opinion, the best chin in all of the UFC. So I say you give him bigger and bigger fights, and he shouldn't go back down and keep fighting lower ranked fighters.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, he's just in this spot where the UFC wants to push all these younger guys. And even though he keeps winning these fights, taking big fights too, he just seems like he's not really getting rewarded. So next, I want to talk about the guy that he did beat. Fiziev had obviously put on a great performance, and he's been in these fights where he can just keep punching and keep trying to knock the guy out. But it just seemed like Gaethje wasn't going to go down. And I think Fiziev kind of saw that and he was a little stunned by it because most of the time, whenever he fights, I mean, if you look through pretty much most of his fights, especially recently, 3 knockouts in his past 4 wins. He's been able to knock out pretty much all the guys that he's fought recently. But I still think with a guy like him who is still, I mean, he's only 30 years old, and especially in the UFC, that's still pretty young. And I still think he's a great fighter too. He might move down a little bit in the rankings, but I still think that if you give him another good fight against a guy coming up, that he could still definitely get a title shot within the next 3 years if he puts another win streak together. And an interesting fight that I would want to see next, I'll ask you how you feel about it, is if we could see Fiziev versus Gamrot.
Ooh, yeah, that would be interesting. Uh, as you know, Banning, I'm a huge fan of Fiziev, and I'm gonna be honest, I think he's a level above Gamrot, and Gamrot did lose recently. But yeah, I think Fiziev is one of these guys that has like his agenda being pushed by the UFC, and Dana White's a big fan of him. I say, yeah, I don't know, honestly. It's an interesting weight class. I think it's gonna be because Chandler's fighting. I think Dariush also is, I'm the most impressed with him out of all the guys ranked outside the top three. In my opinion, Dariush is the one that deserves the next fight to fight for the belt after that. So the fight before that one. So I think Fiziev, yeah, obviously that was a pretty bad loss. Like it was super competitive, but his face got pounded in and he was bleeding everywhere. But I I think you reward him with a bigger fight for that, because Gaethje, like honestly, if that was against any other fighter, he probably would have knocked him out. It's just he happened to fight the best chin in the UFC. I think you have to level him up. Same thing with Gaethje. You just good performances, in my opinion. You need to level up. Where even last fight, Gaethje was the higher ranked fighter and he was still the underdog, which is probably a weird feeling for him. And I don't think they should be rewarding these guys with just lower and lower ranked fighters, because the only thing that could happen is that they get upset eventually, and then it's gonna take them a very long time to fight their way back up.
Yeah, it's just interesting to look, especially with a class this deep, like the welterweight, lightweight, kind of that area, especially with guys going up and down too. We did see Islam kind of challenge Leon Edwards. Not really sure if that's like official or not, but he said that on his Twitter, and Dana White kind of shot that down early. But especially if that does happen at some point, and Islam, like, let's say he wins that and goes up to welterweight, this kind of leaves the division like wide open. And even if like Edwards went down to lightweight for that fight, like both of these divisions are really deep right now. And there's so many young guys too, but it's mixed with all the veterans too that have been on good win streaks and have good wins. So it's just an interesting point, especially now. But like within the next 5 years, I think both of these divisions, especially with all the guys that are coming up too in these divisions, we don't really know what's going to end up happening, just because there's so many fights to make. But obviously, you can't make um, all the fights at once. So I think the UFC is in a good spot right now, especially with these two divisions, just because there's so many fights that you can make.
Yeah, I think
Um, yeah.
I'll say one thing, but I think as I kind of said earlier, it's a super interesting spot for the UFC. Like we haven't really seen this like in a very long time where almost all the champions right now are like first time champions or they just won the belt. And there's so many champions below them who lost their belts that are fighting for it back. So I think in the next like 6 to 8 months, we've been talking a lot about it. We're gonna see a lot of guys who are angry and get their belt back. And it's gonna create a lot of good fights, but it's also gonna lead to a domino effect of guys lower down the rankings who are going to keep winning and keep winning. Guys like Gaethje or Darius, who, in my opinion, have the resume to fight for the belt, but they're just not going to get close enough because of all these guys who are just losing their belt and fighting for it back.
So next we can go into the bantamweight. So another division that's kind of interesting right now. Sean O'Malley was the number one contender for a long time, and then we saw Marab win, and then now he's officially the new number one contender. But the issue with this is that he said he won't fight Aljamain, just because they're really close friends, and I mean this puts Dana White in a situation where he doesn't really know what he's going to do, especially with Sean O'Malley kind of being there, and also like they've had him in the spot for the number one contender, and he almost had the fight too against Aljamain because they weren't really sure if Henry Cejudo would end up fighting or not, or if one of these guys pulled out. But obviously that fight's going to happen. And I mean, I'm going to get my prediction out now. I think Aljamain wins this fight, as much as I don't really like him, and I don't really think he's that good of a champion, especially the way that he won the belt too. But I don't know if I really see Henry Cejudo winning this fight at this point. He's still a really good fighter, but I just think Aljamain wins this fight. But also that kind of leads me to the point where if he wins this fight and Marab doesn't take the fight, do you just give it to O'Malley, or do you think you kind of push Marab to kind of take the fight? Because we've seen Dana White say if he doesn't take this fight, it's going to probably push him back in the rankings. Even though if he doesn't lose and he doesn't take the fight, if Marab says he doesn't want to fight Aljamain right now and he has a title opportunity and he doesn't take it, like he could just not get one for the next like 5 years just because Dana White's kind of upset that he didn't take it.
Yeah, I mean, the UFC is an interesting sport where like a second of a fight can completely change your career. I think it's pretty stupid of him not to take the title fight because we've seen guys like Jose Aldo who looked absolutely unstoppable, and then in 1 second in their fight they lose it all and they can never regain that status. So Marab could go just like Piotr Jan did. He could go on a bad losing streak and lose all of his luck and plummet down the rankings. So in my opinion, I'll actually go back to Cejudo versus Sterling. I actually disagree with you. I think Cejudo is a super impressive wrestler, and I think he's going to submit Aljamain. I think he's just a better wrestler, and I think it's going to work out perfectly where Cejudo wins, and then Merab will get to fight someone that he doesn't like. But anyway, I think it'll be interesting. Sean O'Malley, he does in my opinion, he deserves the ranking for beating Jan, but he doesn't deserve that fight for the belt yet. I think you have to rank him high for beating a high ranked fighter, but you don't have to give him the belt after that. I still think he needs one more fight because his fight against Chito Vera, he got his head pounded into the canvas. And then last night's fight, Chito Vera lost to Corey Sandhagen on decision, and he looked kind of weak and timid. And it's like it doesn't even look like the same guy who's beating the number 2 ranked fighter in the whole weight class. So this weight class as a whole, from Jan to Vera to Sandhagen, have taken a ton of bad losses. So Marab is he's lucky in my opinion. He gets to stay up there because all the guys below him just keep losing and keep losing unlucky fights. So I think it'll be more interesting with Cejudo back into the mix, but I don't think Marab should be wasting his time up here.
So I guess if Aljamain wins and then Marab says he doesn't want to take the fight, would you potentially have a matchup between Sandhagen and O'Malley for the number one contender? Would you consider that?
Yeah, that probably would be it because kind of think of it. O'Malley, he beat Jan, and he did lose to Cheeto
And then
Vera.
Marlon Vera's at 3 right now, but
Yeah, and then he just lost to Sandhagen. So when the rankings, when they do update after that, Sandhagen's probably going to be number 3. So I think you have to give it from O'Malley Sandhagen. That's the only two guys left to one out of that gauntlet of fighters. And I think the winner of that 100% deserves a title shot after that.
yeah, I think we've both talked about this kind of off the air, but like Sean O'Malley and Sandhagen are both kind of guys that the UFC, I guess we've kind of argued that they kind of pushed them a little too much too early. And so I guess I think it would be good and beneficial for both of them if they fought too, because even the loser, unless like one of them gets knocked out within the first 10 seconds, if this goes to a decision or if this ends like in the third round, whatever we see, I think even with a loss, it doesn't move them that far down, especially if, let's say, if Sean O'Malley wins this fight and it's a close fight, and then he goes on to win the title, we would want to see a rematch between him and Sandhagen for the title, or vice versa. So I think either way, especially with two guys who are still pretty young and can both build up a lot, that's a good fight for them because the winner, number one contender, and the loser still within the top 3. Because if Sandhagen loses, he's still beat Vera, and if O'Malley loses, I mean, he still beat Jan. So I think either way for both of these guys, it'll be so if Henry Cejudo wins, this kind of changes the whole division too. I think even if he wins, I think you give Merab the next title fight. But I still do think O'Malley versus Sandhagen should be the number one contender fight. Whether that is the number one contender against the winner of Merab and Cejudo or just against Aljamain, I think we should see a Sean O'Malley versus Sandhagen fight. And then the winner of that should face whoever the champion is within the next year.
Yeah, definitely. I think the way I kind of had it in my head was a kind of like a round robin almost, where you take your losers, Cheeto Vera and Piotr Jan, they fight, O'Malley Sandhagen fight, and then Cejudo versus Sterling while Marab kind of sits out the first round. And then your winners just move on and fight where because Jan, very tough loss. Cheeto Vera, he didn't get knocked out. He was just kind of weak out there and like kind of holding back, it seemed like. And I say you give them the loser of O'Malley Sandhagen. So let's say Jan beats Sandhagen after O'Malley beats Sandhagen, and then Jan wins that fight. Then I think he can fight Merab or Aljamain, whoever's that guy still up there after the Cejudo fight, whoever's decided to be the winner of that. And I think I just think that Merab can't be sitting around and waiting while all the guys like 5 or 6 guys below him are fighting like week in and week out to just maintain their rankings. Well, Merab had a pretty easy win, just like what 43 takedowns or something absurd, and now he just gets to
Yeah.
sit at number 1. That just doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah, I think I like your idea of the round robin. I mean, a lot of these divisions are so close right now that you could just end up making like a tournament at this point from all the guys that kind of deserve these title shots. So next, I want to talk about UFC 287. We won't go over every single fight, but we'll go over most of them. This is a really good card. We'll start from the bottom of the main card. Raul Rosas Jr. is fighting again. He's going to have his first main card fight, and he's fighting against Christian Rodriguez. He's only minus 220 at this point, and all the other fights before this, he's been minus like 1,000, 2,000. It's been a lot more. So this is his closest fight, definitely by far, against Christian Rodriguez, who is 8-1 at this point. And obviously, this is especially against the guys who he's fought against before. This is going to be a little tougher of a fight. That's usually how the UFC gauntlet goes. You get 2, maybe 3 easy fights to start off, and then you finally start to fight people. I know both of us have been interested in Rosas, so I just want to hear who you think. Do you think he's going to come out with this fight?
Yeah, so the first thing I would like to say, shout out to Chris Curtis, but he does not deserve to be on the prelims while Rosas and 18-year-olds on the main card. That's outrageous to me. But this is probably the deepest card, in my opinion, of the entire in a very long time. One of my favorite. We have Like Chris Barnett is a prelim fight. Chiesa, Li Jiangling. These are all prelim fights. Chris Curtis, Kevin Gastelum. Like those are all main card fighters that could be the 2 or 3 spot on a main card fighting in the prelims, which is absurd. So this entire thing is going to be so interesting. But going back to Rosas, he's just one of the guys they're going to push. It happens. Just like every sport, you need your LeBron Jameses, you need your guys who are the young prospects that take over. And it's happened. Sage Northcutt, Patty Pimblett, Bo Nickel now. It happens all the time. And
I mean, Sandhagen and O'Malley, who we were just talking about too, they've had a lot of big pushes recently.
yeah, it happens so much because that's what you need in the UFC. You need excitement. You need young guys. You can't have 40-year-olds just fighting until they just drop dead in the canvas one day. And so, yeah, I think it'll be interesting because everyone has their breaking point. Patty Pimblett is in my opinion, is one fight away from his breaking point that you were talking about, where easy fight, easy fight, easy fight. I think he's one away from getting embarrassed in the ring, and then he'll kind of get humbled. And I think Rosas, I think he wins this fight. I think he's going to submit him. But I think the fight after this one, because this is a main card fight. And if you win a main card fight, you deserve another. So I think the fight after this one, I think he'll have a bad loss, but it won't hurt his career. It'll just be kind of showing him excitement for the card. And I was going to ask you about what's your, besides the Pereira Adesanya, what's your favorite fight on the entire card? Because there's like 5 or 6 that I love that I'm waiting to see.
I'm interested in this fight. I think overall, though, I'm really interested in the Kevin Holland fight. I think he's kind of in this interesting point of his career where he's on a 2-fight losing streak, but I mean, he's still young. He's still only 30. And I think especially, I mean, you lose fights at some point, and he lost those 2 fights, but I still think that if he can string together a winning streak, especially with this fight, I think he could definitely get back up there in the rankings. So I'm interesting to see that because this is kind of a make or break fight for him where if he goes out here and gets an impressive win, that could definitely help boost him back up. But also, if he loses this fight, he's kind of in that spot where he's going to just end up on low main card fights just because he has the name and people recognize him. But he's not going to get a title fight. But if he wins, he'll be on not a fast track, but he'll get back into fighting some higher guys up. So speaking of the fights on this card, another one that I want to talk about, Gilbert Burns versus Jorge. Gilbert Burns, a big favorite in this, minus 470. I think as of right now, I think he's going to win this fight pretty easily. I don't really see Jorge doing that much, especially coming off of a loss and not fighting for that long too. I think Burns wins this fight. I know you talked about him earlier. So I just want to hear how you think, I guess, unless you think Jorge is going to win this, how easily do you think Burns is going to win this?
Yeah, well, I don't want this to be clipped out of context where we're getting made fun of for talking about the easy favorite, but I think Masvidal's best victory was punching Colby Covington in like a nightclub outside the ring. I am not a fan of him at all. Obviously, the Ben Askren thing, like, oh, big deal. But yeah, I think
I mean, Jake Paul knocked out Ben Askren, so how much
exactly.
credibility does that give you?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. But I'm not a fan of Masvidal at all, as you know. And I will tie this back. I think Gilbert Burns, he's just gonna tire him out. He's gonna show his stand-up game is still worth it, and then he'll just get him to the canvas and just. I don't think Masvidal is good on the canvas anymore or stand-up. So, but I will tie it back to Kevin Holland. He is probably one of my favorite fighters for many reasons, but one of the reasons is he does not reject fights. And I think it was 2020 or 2021. He was fighting like almost every single card. He fights a lot of fights, and he's already fought like 30 something probably fights now in his career. And he does lose like the most recent ones. He has lost his 2 last fights. And against Kazmat, that was a big fight against a promising guy. He got embarrassed, and it doesn't even matter. He's gonna keep fighting guys, and if he just keeps racking up these wins, which he can do, then I think he'll be moving up the rankings fast. Because I think his biggest attribute to his game is just the ability to keep fighting. Because we're gonna see it with guys like Merab or even Masvidal and Israel in this fight. When they choose that, when you get higher up the rankings, you have to be smarter about it. You can't, like, Holland can't fight Kazmat again. He'll just get wrestled in a minute again, no matter how good he is at stand up. So you're gonna have to learn to pick your fights. And same thing goes to Burns and Masvidal. I think it's an easy win for Burns.
Yeah, I brought that Kevin Holland up because I know you're a big fan of him. Looking back, he had 3 fights in 2021, 4 fights in, I guess, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 4 fights or 5 fights in 2020. So, I mean, in the past few years, he's had like 10 fights, which you never see that from a UFC fighter, especially like we were talking about earlier, Marab, who has a title fight on his plate, like golden opportunity. He's earned it obviously too, but he's just not going to take a title fight. And then there's guys like Kevin Holland, who, if you offer him a fight contract to fight tomorrow, he will go in there and fight the guy. So I think that we're at a point where there's a lot of lower guys in the rankings who are going to take these fights, because Kevin Holland isn't the only guy. Like obviously there's even we've seen guys that we just talked about too, Rosas, who hasn't had that many fights, but he's come out and said, I want to fight every single person I can, like as much as I can, just to get his name out there, whether he wins or loses. And even guys like Bo Nickel, he's been, obviously he had a quick fight in his debut, but he's come out there and said, I want to fight guys. I want to go out there and I want to prove myself. So I think it's good that we have all these young fighters wanting to do that. But also, I mean, we've seen this before. That's what everyone says. And then they get the title shot. And then they kind of, like you said, you kind of have to like go through and pick who you really want to fight. Because if you're in the top 5 and you lose, especially if it's a guy lower to you that you kind of take as an easy fight to boost yourself, and you lose, that kind of really messes up your track to a championship.
Yeah, definitely. And I think speaking of which, I'll bring this right into Adesanya versus Pereira, where super exciting for me. That's another rivalry where, in my opinion, this settles the rivalry. It started in kickboxing, went to UFC. Adesanya kind of got fraud checked. It happened, and Pereira just, some say it was an early stoppage, and Adesanya was dodging, but I think it was just he was on his way down to dropping to the canvas. But I think it's super interesting that Adesanya a few years ago against fights like Vittori, where he absolutely dominated stand-up wise, he was cocky and confident in the ring, which is what the real champions need if you want to keep defending that belt. But against Pereira, a tall fighter like him, a kickboxer, someone who he is also just like him still. And Pereira just he got like almost dropped once, but I think it kind of proved to me that Adesanya is not all of that, and it's more open than we think it is. Where I was a huge fan of Pereira that fight. I predicted him winning. Just a big, tall guy, a big frame, a kickboxer with the same height and build as Adesanya. So I'm curious to think, what are your predictions for this fight?
So before this, the only fight that Adesanya lost, obviously going up in weight, fighting for that other belt, and it's like the same thing with Volk. Like you're not, it says a loss on your record too, but especially with that fight going to decision, he did lose like unanimously, but still going to decision against a guy in a higher weight class, I don't hold it against him. But against Pereira, who he lost against too, in kind of a almost shocking to me, because I thought Adesanya was going to go in here and maybe not dominate, but still get a good win. And then coming into the 5th round, it looked like he had control for a good amount of the fight and then ends up losing. I saw John Jones say this a few weeks ago, and before it, I didn't really think about it, but I completely agree with him. Sometimes there's a guy that you end up fighting or you end up competing against that just has your number no matter what you do. And I think Pereira is that guy for Adesanya. We saw this like obviously the only guy that he's lost to, like I just said, going up in weight, but he's been able to beat every other person. And I think Pereira wins this just because he has that. He's in his head, no matter what Israel wants to say, a guy that has beat you this many times in so many different settings. And then kind of like a ghost, like the ghost from his past came in and fought him in his setting in the UFC when Israel was champion. And then he ends up losing to him again. Like, obviously, that has a big toll on you mentally because this guy has your number and it seems like there's no way that you can beat him. But if Israel wins this fight, I think obviously I don't know if necessarily the rivalry's over just because it would only be the second time they're fighting in the UFC. So I think they could fight again, especially if it's close. But like you said, I think if Pereira wins this, obviously the rivalry is over. So you did have Pereira winning, right?
Yeah, I did again. And it was a close fight last fight, but I think Adesanya will want to get his get back. But I think that Pereira just, yeah, kind of like you said, he has his number. So, in my opinion, it will be a close fight. It's by no means a blowout, but I think Pereira's he's just gonna outfight him to stand up wise. I think it'll probably get the decision. I don't really think he'll get knocked out. It might be a TKO, but I just think it's a win for Pereira either way.
So I guess with that in mind, where do you see both of these guys going after this? I'll just start asking you, where do you see Adesanya going after this? Because obviously, if he loses this, I still think he's the number one contender, but I don't see him getting a title fight immediately after. I think he'd definitely have to work back up to even get that consideration again.
Yeah, I think Adesanya's kind of dominated middleweight for a long time now, where like Whitaker, Vittori, like Paulo Costa, like he's beat these guys very easily. So I don't think you can put him below that. In my opinion, you do have
Do you
to
see him
drop.
going up or down? Do you think in weight class, considering that?
I think I that's interesting. I don't think like light heavyweight is open for him, but I can't see him moving up. But I don't know. I mean, are you saying he wouldn't stay?
Well, I mean, like you said, I think he's dominated that weight class. And if Pereira is the champion and he just lost to him twice, I don't see him getting that fight. And even if he runs through the division again, is he just going to be running around for 3 years trying to get a title fight against the guy he's lost to twice? So I guess that kind of puts him in an interesting spot too. And with Jamal Hill at light heavyweight champion, for now, we don't know what's going to happen. I still think Yuri, when he comes back, will beat him. And there's still good guys up there. That obviously there's good contenders like Anklev, who his last fight, obviously, we don't know if he's going to fight again in the UFC. He said after that he doesn't really want to. I'm sure he will, but still an open weight class too with Jamal Hill. He's definitely not like the strongest champion in any of the weight classes at this point. So I don't know if Israel goes down to fight too, because if he goes in that welterweight, that would be interesting to see. But he's already kind of his build that he has. I don't really think he's going to be able to drop weight because he fights pretty skinny too, especially at middleweight. But if he loses this fight, it does put him in an interesting situation where we could honestly see maybe even that like John Jones career path where he might take a year or two off and like try to naturally bulk up to end up fighting at light heavyweight. So I don't know. It's just he's in a weird situation at this point.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because at light heavyweight, Jamal Hill's he's pretty much an interim champion. He won it off an old man that was retiring anyway, and it was an impressive win, but it's a belt that can be taken easily and probably will be soon. But welterweight is the most stacked division. But in my opinion, Adesanya, if he moved down, I think he could beat Leon Edwards, honestly. I think he's just a taller, better Leon Edwards. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Adesanya, his best trait is finding his depth against smaller fighters than him. And I think he's taller than Leon Edwards. His frame is just more suited for fighting these smaller guys. So he would be incredibly late, but I still think he could do it. But realistically, he could go either way. But I think if he loses to Pereira, he'd probably take a year or two off and then it probably bulk back up or maybe cut down, I guess. But
So kind of wrapping it up, we have had a rumored UFC 290 card. This is going to be the International Fight Week card that we've seen. So we're kind of just waiting on it to be officially announced. But we have John Jones versus Stipe Miocic. They're building it as the greatest of all time against the greatest heavyweight of all time. You could definitely argue for Stipe being the heavyweight GOAT, but I think there's also a few guys that you could go with too, just because the heavyweight, especially in UFC history, most heavyweight champions defended the belt maybe twice. If they were lucky, the belt kind of moved around for like a 10-year period, pretty much almost every fight. I mean, we saw guys like Brock Lesnar come in and just win the title and then just lose it and then leave again. So it's interesting. There's a lot of guys up there too that you could argue. I do think, just getting this out of the way, John Jones wins this fight very easily. I think the last fight against Gane, I expected a lot more just because I think Serial had a good resume before this, and I think you could definitely argue that he was in that spot where the UFC likes to put guys in title fights too early. But I mean, this kind of just shows if Stipe is the next guy, this division right now, the heavyweight division is in shambles, in my opinion, at least. So, I guess my question for you is, if you have John Jones winning, where does he go after this?
Yeah. First of all, if John Jones does defend the heavyweight belt after a year off, like he is without a doubt the go. It wouldn't even be close anymore. And I think a dream scenario is John Jones stays at heavyweight and he gets kind of a better frame because he's still, although he took a year off, he still had a lot of criticism for not really. It kind of looked like he was gaining weight fast and he didn't really define his like physique as much as he could have for the heavyweight fight. None of it mattered. He still killed Gone, but I think it is a weird weight class because anything can happen where you can get dropped with one crazy like punch. So that's why the belt moves around so much. It's big guys swinging as hard as they can. So I think it'd be interesting, but I think John's in a dream scenario. I think he stays at heavyweight. He keeps defending the belt, and honestly, I think he's head and shoulders above the entire weight class. So I think best case scenario, he stays at heavyweight. He defends it. He could defend it 3 more times, 4 more times if he really wanted to stay up there. And then he could retire as the undisputed GOAT without taking any more damage or bad losses.
Yeah, I think coming off of this Stipe fight where I think he wins pretty easily too, whether he wants to wrestle him or just stand up, I don't see any world where I mean, I'll even say it now. I don't see where any world that he doesn't win within 3 rounds, maybe even 2.5. Like, I don't see this going past the third round at all. So I guess kind of the winner too. It's kind of weird because there's no guy in the heavyweight class that I look at and I'm like, oh, I think this guy should fight against John Jones. Like I love Tai Tuivasa, but if he fights against John Jones, we saw what happened when he fought against Gon. He's just gonna get stand up and he's just gonna get rocked. And I mean, Tai Tuivasa is the sixth ranked heavyweight right now. And I guess it just shows that this class isn't that great at this point. But the next fight to make, obviously, I think at this point, there's not really many other options. But Curtis Blades fighting against Pavlicich, April 22nd. And I think this is the number one contender fight too. So it'll be interesting depending on who wins this. I think if Curtis Blades end up winning, then it'll be a little more interesting, like stand-up wise against John Jones, just to see. Because I think John Jones wants to prove, and I think he will in the next fight against Miocic, that he can stand up and fight at heavyweight. Because if he goes and wrestles these guys, a lot of the heavyweights, not great wrestlers, and they're massive, so you don't really expect that too much from these guys. Like Tai Tuivasa just goes in there and kicks the shit out of these guys and just tries to knock them out. And that's what heavyweight has been for a long time. So I think John Jones wants to prove that he can actually stand and bang with most of these guys because he could definitely just wrestle these guys and sit on top of them and win every single fight if he wanted to. So I guess, I mean, if he fights the winner of Blades versus Pavlicich, it'll just be interesting because even after that fight, um, assuming that they fight this year or maybe early next year after he beats Stipe in June or July, whenever that's set. Like you said, he could definitely through this division, but the UFC doesn't really get that much out of it, I guess. They get money from the John Jones side, but if he ends up fighting these guys who he's just going to end up beating by that much, like what do you do at this point for a guy like him?
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, I think he stays and he fights because we've seen it with Anderson Silva, with Jose Aldo, with Yo Romero, like these guys who look like they're unstoppable, like they look like gods in the ring. And then one day they get unlucky and they get absolutely knocked out by some random person. It can happen to anyone. I think Johns is too big of an ego. He's taken hate over his career to really to play dumb with these guys and try and stand and bang. I think we're gonna see John Jones against Stipe. If he would never fight Tuivasa, I don't think, but let's say it does happen. I think he goes right to the canvas. He wrestles him in 1 minute, just like against Garm. I think he understands like the risk of being a heavyweight. Like guys like even like Chris Barnett, like massive guys. Chris Barnett, if he tried to stand up bang with John Jones, he could land a lucky punch that would send him to the hospital. And then does that make him the GOAT? No, it doesn't. It was just a nice punch. So I think the smartest option for Jones, stay at heavyweight and just fight smart. Jones can dominate them in any way he wants to. So find the easiest way to do it and just keep the defenses while you can, because guys like Jose Aldo and Anderson Silva, where they're getting all these title defenses, or George St. Pierre, they're getting all these title defenses and they look like the GOAT and everyone's almost getting bored with them. But then one day, boom, it's over in 1 minute and then they can never get it back.
Yeah. So, I mean, with that career path, we might see John Jones versus Jake Paul in a boxing match at some point if he's going to end up like Anderson Silva. But I do think John Jones, I don't know how much he has to prove to anyone. I think he's in his Tom Brady arc right now where he just won the Super Bowl, like we saw with Tom Brady. He won the championship. And I think he's going to end up taking, like, his deal right now is he has 2 more fights. I don't know if I see him fighting more than 2 fights, just because if he defends the belt, I guess that would be, if he has 2 more fights, he defends the belt twice. That's still like he's in the upper 90% of heavyweights all time, just because that belt has been passed around so much. And we've never really seen a champion defend the belt more than once, maybe more than twice at the most. So I don't think he really has that much to prove too. And kind of like you said, the older that he gets, the more obviously everyone else too that comes up someone could definitely just knock him out at some point, just because that's how the heavyweight works. So I think he has 2 or 3 more fights and then he retires. I think he retires as champion. He doesn't have anything else to prove, but I don't think he's at the point where he needs to retire at this point. But I could definitely see him going out kind of on that Khabib kind of high note where he goes through the heavyweight division. And I think he can go through the heavyweight division in 3 fights, just because he goes through Ciryl Gane, who is the #1 contender. He goes through Stipe, who many say is the heavyweight GOAT. And then he goes against the winner of Blades and Pavlovich, and he knocks out that guy too. So he knocks out the 3 heavyweight contenders, and then he leaves, and then he retires.
Yeah, I think we could see Jones. I can imagine it now. It's in Abu Dhabi, and Jones is he's in the snow, he's running around. And I think that's the best way to end it for him. Just get some good wins and then, enjoy his outside the octagon antics.
Yeah, whatever he wants to do outside of the octagon. So I guess one thing left that I want to talk about too, kind of an interesting thing that we've seen recently, talking about heavyweights. There has been rumors that we will see Francis Ngannou versus Deontay Wilder in a 2-fight deal. The first fight being an MMA fight and the second being a boxing fight. So just putting this out there, I want to hear your initial reactions to this.
Yeah, well, the first thing I will say is I actually forgot about Ngannou. And I know you know this, but I've always predicted, I think Ngannou will be back in a year or 2. I think John Jones is going to beat Stipe, and then Ngannou will come back with a crazy revised deal. He's going to get a lot of money. John Jones will get a lot of money. And I think that will be the heavyweight. That's what I was kind of forgetting about. I think John Jones beats Stipe. And then let's say Curtis Blades is the next guy up. I think Jones will fight Ngannou. And then the winner of that will then fight Blades or Pavlovich, whoever wins. So I think Ngannou will be back in the UFC after this stuff. But yeah, going back to your question, I think it will be interesting. I do like crossovers, whether it's Jake Paul versus MMA fighters or Conor McGregor boxing Floyd Mayweather. I think they're interesting, but I'm not too interested in Ngannou Wilder. I'm a huge fan of both of them, but I think it would lead to some brain damage, guaranteed, probably. I think boxers are completely underestimating MMA. I'm a huge fan of boxing, but Deontay Wilder, if you look at his legs, look at his lower body, Ngannou would kick him in both his legs. He would have a double leg break in 10 seconds. I think the MMA fight, I do not want to see that at all. That would just be homicide in a ring. But the boxing would be interesting, where I think Ngannou probably underestimates Wilder's boxing too. But to answer your question, we saw it with McGregor Mayweather, where McGregor he landed a lot of punches. He did better than people thought, but the punches, it's not the same, because in boxing you're putting everything into a punch, because they can't slip that and take you down. They can't put you in a guillotine after you go for a punch. So like McGregor, who's landing, but he had no effect on Mayweather. I think it'd be a similar deal where Ngannou, he could be throwing crazy just like Wilder does, but at the end of the day, just the way the sports work in your mind, the way the sports operate, where Ngannou's waiting for a takedown or a leg kick and Wilder's is focusing on the head. I think they both would win their respective sport.
Yeah. I think like comparing these two guys to boxing and MMA, I think the boxing match makes a lot of sense because there's not as much risk. But like you said, if you put Deontay Wilder into a octagon, I think, for instance, Ngannou is going to kill him. Like I don't even think it would be close. I think it would be less than 2 minutes, and I think Ngannou chases him down. And whether he takes him down with a leg kick and breaks his leg, or he just tackles him to the ground and just like ground and pound and just absolutely like destroys him. I don't think it's close. And if we go into boxing too, I think Deontay Wilder knocks him out within the first 2 rounds. Deontay Wilder, I think people forget how good he really is. Obviously, losing to Tyson Fury, and I think that rivalry reminds me a lot of Adesanya and Pereira, where Tyson Fury just had his number, even though Deontay Wilder could knock out, I think, any person in the heavyweight class right now, whether you put him against Anthony Joshua, who I think he completely knocks out too. Even though Anthony Joshua was the champion for a while, we never got to see that fight. Maybe we will at some point. But I think these two guys, I would rather see in a boxing fight than an MMA fight, just because an MMA fight is not going to be close. And I do think a boxing fight won't be as close. I do think Wilder wins and knocks him out, but I guess it's a little more interesting and there's less risk involved for both of these guys too.
Yeah, yeah, I feel the exact same. I will say that the boxing, Ngannou, you've seen it. I think it was against Rosenstrike, but sometimes he does swing crazy, and that's what Wilder's known for. Just no defense. It's crazy overhand punches. So I think if he wants to fight the Bronze Bomber the way he fights, like we could see an interesting fight similar to what we were just saying, heavyweight weight class, where sometimes they just start throwing. And if they just want to stand and bang, just go crazy throwing, honestly, Ngannou has a chance of just landing punches, but Wilder has the best power in the world of boxing. And whether
I
that
would argue the best knockout power of all time.
and that's probably fair, but whether that translates to fighting an MMA fighter, I guess we'll have to wait to see. But I think it would at least be interesting. The UFC fight, I have no desire to see that. That would just be like you could put a 2-year-old kid in the ring against him. It would be the exact same outcome.
Yeah. And I guess going back to your point about Ngannou going to the UFC, I think we all want to see him versus John Jones. And depending on how long this takes, if he fights Stipe in July and then he ends up fighting Curtis Blades in December or January of next year, whenever that happens, assuming that he wins, or he fights Pavlicich, whoever wins that fight, I do think that let's say both of those fights happen and then he's sitting at champion next January, we could see him just kind of an unofficial retirement, be like, I'm not coming back to fight unless it's against Ngannou, because I think that's the only fight after that. I don't think there's anyone else that he really needs to fight to, just especially in the heavyweight class within the UFC. There's no one else for him to fight. So I don't know if Ngannou is going to come back. Dana White has said that Ngannou is never coming back to the UFC, but everyone wants to see John Jones versus Ngannou. I think that would be the fight to make. And I don't know if it's going to ever happen, especially if Ngannou doesn't come back. I don't see any other setting where this happens. I don't think John Jones goes in to be a boxer. I don't think he's that stupid. Like he knows what he's doing. He's not going to go be a crossover boxer to fight Ngannou. I don't think anyone wants to see that. It would be interesting, but like we want to see these guys fight inside the cage. And I think it's sad that we might never get to see it, but I guess there's still hope that we can hold out for it.
Yeah, luckily John Jones is known for his wits outside the octagon. So hopefully
Yeah, he'll get something done.
yeah.
Or he could just jump him on the sidewalk like Street Judas, and then we can see a fight there.
Exactly. Maybe they could have a competition of like hit and runs or some crime, but I think John wins unanimous decision on hit and runs. So
Yeah. And I guess between Ngannou and Wilder, I think the winner of that fights against Deji in a boxing match. And I think everything's wrapped up in the combat world.
yeah, the best have to fight the best.
So I think that's pretty much it for this first episode. We had a lot to talk about, and I guess the next time that we'll see you guys is after the Adesanya and Pereira fight. So we'll come back for that, and we'll give you our thoughts about what happens then. I guess as of right now, both of our predictions is we have Pereira winning. We'll probably put something out on the Instagram at some point about kind of decisions for that whole card and predictions and stuff. But as of right now, we gave our predictions throughout the podcast, so we'll kind of put a summary up right before the card. But I guess that's really it for this episode. So we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Yep. Thank you.